It's good morning. Hello. How are you doing? I see, Matt, they've got you in this sort of little enclosure during the service now. It's got kind of walls, it's got a roof. It's basically a house in the Hitchin housing market, I suspect, will probably sell for about £100,000. So as you heard, I've been a youth worker for most of my life. I know, looking at me, that might seem unlikely, given that I'm essentially a walking ad for M&S menswear. I was with a group of 11-year-olds, and I'd given a presentation to them, and at the end I said, "Any questions?" And one of the 11-year-old boys put his hand up and he said, "Yes, I've got a question. It's in 2 parts. And the first part is metaphysical." I said, I think that's actually all the time we've got this morning for questions. We're going to have to end the session there. I love the way young people rock the status quo of the church and look at things differently. And I really hope this morning I'm going to channel a little bit of that as we look together at an incredible story in the Gospel of Mark chapter 5. And I'm thinking for most of you, perhaps not all, this will be a familiar story, but I want us to read it together, and then I'm going to speak for somewhere between an hour and a half. You thought you were coming for lunch, you're coming for dinner. All right, so in Mark chapter 5, there's this story. We call it the story of the demon-possessed man often. It says this, I'm reading from the NIV. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. The man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he'd often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the God Most High? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting in the boat, the man who'd been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And all the people were amazed. So what I really want to talk about this morning is going from church. I mean, we think, don't we, that what God is really interested in is us coming to church. We talk about it a lot, don't we? You're coming to church. Are you inviting anybody to church? Are you coming to church on Sunday next week? Are you coming to the celebration this morning? Oh, you came. Oh, we didn't know whether you were coming this morning. You're here. You came to church. I don't know who you are. Hello. But what if that wasn't the point? Martin Luther King Jr., our greatest civil rights leader, but also a profound preacher and pastor, said, church is not the place you come to, it's the place you go from. This isn't the end point getting here this morning. The most pressing question is, where are you going from here? What are you going to do as a result of being here? Going from church is as important as going to church. I figure that's why most of the time seats in church are so uncomfortable. And you're rocking that with comfortable seats here this morning. Because we're not meant to stay here. Remember, the resurrected Jesus tells his followers that once they've received the Spirit, they are to, well done, Pastor. And notice where he tells them to go, because this is really the point of this morning. He starts, doesn't he, with Jerusalem and Judea, the place they live, the people they know, the neighbors they had. He said, start there. But Jerusalem, Judea, and then Samaria, their sworn enemies who'd sided with the Romans when they'd invaded. And then finally, where? Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then the ends of the earth. To people, therefore, who are likely to be different to you, who will likely speak a different language to you, who will almost certainly have a different culture to you. So I want to take a few minutes this morning, won't be an hour and a half, to look at this story in Mark 5, because I think this story is really helpful to me wrestling with that challenge. So verse 1 of the chapter we just read says, they went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. Now there is so much there in that one sentence. It's so easy to miss. I mean, you look at it, you just think, well, Mark's just he's just setting up the story, right? This is just the bit to get to the real bit. But he's doing so much more, so brilliantly, so subversively with this verse. What's the big deal? It just says they went across the lake. Well, let's back up a little bit, can we, to the beginning of Mark's gospel. Because in chapter 1, it says that Jesus was on the west side of the lake, so the east side of the lake, where he'd grown up, and he was in the synagogue. Then in chapter 2, Jesus is back in Capernaum, a little fishing village just nearby. Then later in chapter 2, he goes out beside the lake and something happens on the Sabbath. Then in chapter 3, he's back in the local synagogue again where he grew up. And later in the same chapter, he takes his disciples to the lake and a large crowd from his surrounding area follows. And again in chapter 4, Jesus is teaching people by the lake. So synagogue, Capernaum, out by the lake, Sabbath, synagogue, lake, large crowd from Galilee. So far in Mark's gospel, Jesus is essentially spending time in a small area on this side of the Lake of Galilee. And he's spending his time among Orthodox Jewish people, a lot like him. He's basically hanging with his tribe. He's hanging out with the people he's grown up with in a world he knows, the synagogue, everything that's been part of his life for these 30 years. It's a story that's been unfolding in chapters 1 to 4 in a particular space, in a particular place, among a very particular group of people. And then in Mark 5, verse 1, you get this moment where Mark says they went across the lake. Now, the reason I'm laboring this point is because going across the lake was like leaving one world and entering another. What the storyteller, what Mark is doing very subtly, is saying that in chapter 5, they leave the known, the familiar, the comfortable. They leave their small, tightly knit Jewish world and they go across to a very different world. And the early readers of this story would have understood what a big deal that was. Because on the other side of the lake was the region of the Gerasenes. Gerasenes comes from one of the cities on the other side, Gerasa, and there were 10 cities on that side of the lake. In fact, the region was normally called the Decapolis. This is where my 2 years of Latin at school come in helpfully. Deca, 10, polis, city, 10 cities, Decapolis. And these cities were actually established by Alexander the Great. You didn't know you were getting history this morning, did you? Some of you are like, yeah, no, I did not. Well, you are. Alexander the Great established these cities. They had a very strong Greek influence. There was Greek culture, there was Greek food. Many of them would have worshipped Greek gods. They ate pork, hence the herd of pigs. We're coming to them later. It was a totally different world to the small world that Jesus and the disciples had come from. I mean, maybe they'd been up to Jerusalem once or twice for a feast, for a big moment as they grew up, but I think almost certainly they had never been across the lake to effectively a different country. And suddenly at the start of chapter 5, Jesus is saying to his disciples, let's go to the other side of the lake. Do you see how big that is? I wonder if Jesus is saying to you, to me this morning as a church, let's go over the other side of the lake. Up until now, maybe your Christian life has basically been hanging out with your tribe. Church at home, Sunday celebration, worship, communion, church at home, Sunday worship, hanging with your tribe. But beyond these walls is another community that is so far from us, it might as well be across a lake. They have no knowledge or interest in the songs we sing or the prayers we pray or the bread we break. If they notice the church at all, they see it as a failed and out-of-date institution that speaks in incomprehensible words that might as well be another language. But Jesus is saying to the church, to you maybe, at Zeo and as individuals, let's go over to the other side of the lake. Out of the familiar and the known and the safe and the predictable. In 2013, the day before 120 cardinals went into the conclave to choose the next pope, Jorge Bergoglio, who the next day was to become Pope Francis, said, Jesus is standing at the door of the church knocking, asking to be let out. Let's go over to the other side of the lake. I wonder if there's part of you that deep down longs in your Christian life for more than this. You love the church, you love the celebrations, you value the community, which is beautiful, but even so, there's this itch, this sense that your faith is domesticated and tame. That there's a journey you need to take, an adventure into the community beyond these walls. So off they go, these disciples with Jesus, and they go across the lake. And remember, Galilee is huge. It's sometimes called the Sea of Galilee. It's 13 miles long and 7 miles wide. So across they head. But while they're doing that, and before they get to the other side and meet this man, we're going to talk about him in a moment, I think there's a little bit more we need to know about where they're going. So let's just sort of leave them in the boat halfway across Galilee. We'll come back. They're working their way across. And let's talk about the region of the Gerasenes for a moment. A lot of what we know comes from a Jewish historian who was alive at the time called Josephus. He wrote lots about what it was like to be alive in first century Judea. And he describes something in the book, in one of his books, that took place in exactly the location we're talking about here in Mark. You see, there's an uprising against the Romans in the city of Gerasa. Remember, the Romans have brutally occupied Judea, and they are ruthless. They're totally ruthless, and there's an uprising. So the Romans send a legion of soldiers to put it down. Remember, they've invaded the whole region. They run it. As I say, they're brutal. They take the city back almost immediately. And then as a punishment, the first thing they do when they've reestablished control is they bring 1,000 young men into the town square and slaughter them. They take every woman and child and take them into slavery. They then allow the Roman soldiers to pillage all the houses before burning it and all the surrounding villages to the ground. And you can only imagine in the wake of that sort of trauma and tragedy, you can imagine the aftermath of something like that. And I think Mark is subtly referring to that in the first verse because it's very unusual to call it the region of the Gerasenes. Normally it was just called the Decapolis. But somehow I think in saying and using that term, Mark is reminding what all of his readers would have immediately realized. It has an awful connotation like Hillsborough or Dunblane. It's a place riven with tragedy. And the first thing you think of when you think of that name is what has happened there. So by saying going to the region of the Gerasenes, everyone's thinking, oh, Gerasa. Yeah, okay. I remember that. I know what happened there. So let's talk about what happens. They get to the other side of the lake and they meet this man. We're going to talk about this man. What do we know about him? Well, we know that he's in deep trauma. He cuts himself. Cutting yourself, self-harm, is often a way of dealing with overwhelming pain. And he's crying out. The pain is so great. Whatever he's been through, it's so great, so awful that he's literally screaming with it. So you got to wonder what happened to him. Did he watch his son, perhaps just 14 or 15 years old, get slaughtered in the town square by the Romans? Did he see his wife and young children get taken away into slavery? Never going to see them again, never going to know if they're even alive. Did he flee for his own life into the hills? And what does that kind of ordeal do to you? I find it hard to believe there isn't some kind of link. I always assumed in reading this story, when it says he cried out, that that's the demons crying. But actually, as I've read it again and again, I don't think it is. I think it's just his pain. I think it's him as a human being crying out in pain. And what do the people around him do with someone in that kind of trauma? How do they respond or help? They bind him up. They imprison him. They put him out the way. It's so annoying to have him crying out in the town where you live, so they remove him out of sight to a place that sort of describes what they think of him, a graveyard. You basically treat him as dead. You know, as a society, I still don't think we know what to do with people dealing with trauma. How we can hold them in their pain. Visit any prison, visit Bedford Prison, and you'll meet people who've not only done terrible things, but also have the most terrible trauma in their lives. But we don't seem to know how to help them, so we just put them out the way and we lock them up. Back to the story. Because this man isn't just traumatized by the past. Think about it, his needs are actually much more than that. He's homeless. He has no home to live. He's so destitute that he doesn't have any clothes. He has no job, no means of income. And then, of course, the biggest thing of all, he's spiritually oppressed. Demonic forces have got a grip on him. So it's not straightforward. He's got lots of needs. What I really want us to do is not see this man just as the protagonist in this story, but as a human being. You don't just suddenly become someone violently restrained among the tombs, oppressed by evil forces. There's a story behind that. Like there's a story behind all pain and dysfunction. The worst behaved boy in a school I visited, aged 11, out of control. Chairs thrown during the lesson, is also the boy whose mother is an alcoholic and who would lock him out on the balcony of their flat in one of the high-rises in Parktown in Luton, whose father was in Bedford prison. And the more you see this, the more you see that, the more this scary, out-of-control teenager becomes a vulnerable, broken child. Jesus always sees the vulnerable, broken child. Do you notice the first thing Jesus does when he meets the man? He asks him his name. Now, because we're reading the story and as Mark tells it, and because we know that the demons reply, I've always thought that he's addressing the demons. What's your name? And they butt in. But again, the more I read this story, the more I think, I don't think that's what Jesus is doing. I think he's asking the man his name. Freak, weirdo, psycho. I just imagine this man has been called everything and many words that I can't say up here this morning. I wonder whether anyone has used his name in a long time. He's just the freak up among the tombs. That's just who he is. But the first thing Jesus does is say, "What is your name?" If we dare to go to the other side of the lake, our first task is to see those we meet, not as problems to be fixed or people to be converted, but as human beings known and loved by God. The gospel always sees people as individuals. It's the opposite of those who try and make people into others, immigrants, alcoholics. We collect people together, don't we, in groups that dehumanize them. But Jesus asks him his name. Matthew, by the way, is the name of the young man on the balcony, aged 11. The families living in your street who you've never spoken to have names. That young person loitering in a hoodie by the shop has a name. That Afghan refugee in a bedsit on the corner who you sometimes see has a name. What if we as a church weren't just the people who try and persuade those around us to come to church, whether we live in Hitchin or beyond? What if the starting point for our mission was to be the people known for seeing beyond the clutter and the chaos of people's lives, to see them as human beings? What if that was what we were known for? If the people in the community out there have any expectation about you as a Christian, it's that you will judge them, look down on them. And to be honest with you, that is sometimes correct, sadly. But I'm convinced we will never really make any difference until we learn to follow Jesus in the radical way he sees people. So back to the story. We're nearly there. And it's not the man who answers Jesus' question, but the evil spirits who've got a grip on him. And they answer, "My name is Legion." Find that extraordinary. Given what we know about the Romans at this time, of all the ways these demons choose to describe themselves, they choose a Roman military term. That is not a coincidence. In fact, there's more, because the most feared legion in Judea at this time was the 10th Legion. They were the most ruthless, the most brutal. I don't know whether they had been involved in this region, but in AD 73, much later, they're the ones who lay siege to Masada, and they're feared so much that 960 Jewish men, women, and children commit suicide rather than be captured by the 10th Legion. And you know, each legion has a symbol, a kind of emblem that would be on their flag. Have a guess what the emblem of the 10th Legion is. a pig. That's their image. This does not feel like a coincidence. There's something here about how a society, not just individuals, have oppressed this man. He's been broken by the system. But there's something else I want you to notice as well. I want you to notice the power of Jesus to meet this man's needs. Perhaps we shouldn't need reminding, but maybe sometimes we do. Jesus is more powerful than the demonic forces, the trauma, the poverty, the emptiness, the pain they have brought. As much as they have ruled this man's life, they are now confronted by someone who has power over all things. Jesus, the cross and the resurrection, these have forever changed the power of these demonic forces and all of the brokenness and emptiness of the world. I'm not suggesting everyone we meet in the community will be dealing with all of this at this level. But let's not forget what people are living with right now here in Hitchin. The anxiety about making ends meet, keeping a roof over your family's heads, 0-hour contracts, prices rising every time you visit the supermarket or a bill arrives. The isolation so many people feel, young people who are more connected than any other generation through their phones, and now the age group suffering with the greatest sense of loneliness. The fear of being exposed or cancelled. Knowing the person you present yourself is not who you really are. The terror of wars in distant lands that comes closer and closer. A climate crisis that might end it all anyway. But all of these fall in submission to Jesus. He's bigger than the anxiety and the isolation and the fear and the terror. As my friend Chris Russell says, we have good news. I'm convinced if we really understood how good the good news is, we'd be out the door. That you are truly seen, that you are truly known, that you are loved, that you've got a reason to live, that there's someone who knows your fears, there's someone who knows your secrets and the distance between what you present yourself to be and what you know yourself to be, that there is strength and joy and life, and that you are not on your own in this big, frightening world. And however wonderfully they sang it at Radio 1's gig in Luton, Coldplay cannot fix you. But Jesus will cross a lake to come and find you. Back to the story as we land this, and we find the man, and something dramatic and beautiful has happened. Notice what's changed. He's unbound. He's no longer screaming. He's sitting. His trauma is being healed. He has clothes. I'm relieved. His practical needs are being met. This is the power of the gospel to meet all your needs. We think this story often is just about the demon possession. This man's life is made whole in every sense. And look what happens now this man's been restored. He asks Jesus if he can join his training program. He says, can I come with you? They're now getting back into the boats to go back across the lake. Can I come with you and hang out with you? Can I become a disciple? He's right there by the lake, just as they're getting in their boats to head back. And what does Jesus say? No! What he does instead is say to the man, go to your people and tell them what I've done for you, and tell them about the mercy God has shown them. Just tell them your story. Tell your family, tell your neighbors, tell your friends, tell the people at the market, you're ready. You can do it. It's as if Jesus has more faith in this man than he has in himself. We talk, don't we, about having faith in Jesus, but have you ever thought about the fact that Jesus has faith in you? You've got this. Go. You're ready. You don't need to have a theological education to get started. It's about your lived experience of healing and grace and mercy. This man is literally 2 minutes into his faith, and Jesus is telling him to go. We are ready right now in our imperfect state to go across the lake. There's a final twist. I promise we're coming into land. One last thing about this story we should notice. If you go back to the moment Jesus healed the man and the spirits run into the pig, and they in turn fling themselves off a cliff to be drowned, and apologies to those of you that are fans of pigs, they do not end up well in this story. Do you notice how it says the pig herders run into the town and then a bunch of people come up and plead with Jesus to leave? You see how deep the despair is, right? You see how dark the cloud is oppressing these people. The despair is so great that when healing and liberation come, they're terrified of it. The shame, the humiliation, the horror have set into such a degree that they become entrenched to the point where someone freeing them is alarming. I've seen that in young people caught up in crazy stuff, heading the wrong way, and they see this possibility of rescue, but it's too much, it's too scary, so they just choose to stay where they are. But now let's flip forward to Mark 7. Jesus in Mark 7 goes back to the Decapolis again. This time, he heals a man born deaf who could hardly speak. He heals him. There's hope. But look what happens this time round in verse 36 and 37. I'm going to read it to you if you're not that quick. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He's done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. So instead of saying, go away, they're saying, we want more of this. I wonder what's changed between Mark 5 and Mark 7. I like to think it's down to the man from the tombs. He's been sharing his story just like Jesus told him to, just telling people what happened to him. And you know what? That's changed people's minds and opened their heart. Leslie Newbegin, one of our great theologians, says the moment of the Great Commission is not at the end of Matthew. It's Jesus' words at the Last Supper in John 12, where he says, where I am, my servant will also be. Where is Jesus now? He's already at work in our community. He's already out there. The question is, are we going to follow? Are we going to cross the lake? You came here this morning. You came to church. But the real question is, where are you going to go from church? Where is God calling us? Amen.